Okay, so this video is going to be about finding your frame. Now, ordinarily, one of the most important pieces of advice when you're setting up an interview or anything is to set your frame before you set your lights. You can't just light abstractly. You have to light for the particular frame. So you make that decision first and then you arrange your lights. And one of the videos I'm going to show you says that right up front, and I agree with it. However, you're in a tricky spot because many of you, most of you probably won't actually be using light fixtures. You can use house lamps like this right here. And you can do things, if you want, but a lot of you are going to be depending mostly on natural light. So when you're scouting locations, most likely in your house, and you're thinking about the frame in that location, you've got to think simultaneously about the availability of natural light or any other lights in that area, and the quality, the intensity, the directionality, and the color of those lights. And you got to do that all at the same time as you're thinking about the frame. So, in addition to that, finding the frame, 5 compositional principles. Now, you could Google compositional principles and come up with a lot of different lists. I'm going to give you 5 that I think are important, especially when you're doing an interview setup, and especially when you're kind of in a pinch. Those 5 principles are the rule of thirds, headroom, lead room, also known as look room. Oh, my desk lamp just fell down. I shouldn't have messed with it. Where was I? Rule of thirds, headroom, lead room, also known as look room or nose room or eye room, all interchangeable terms. And then depth, which is a really, really important one. And then color and tonal contrast, which is sort of the icing on the cake. So 5 principles. I'm going to show a couple videos, but I'm going to start with some of my examples and then work towards those videos. Okay, so first thing is the rule of thirds. Now, if you just Google rule of thirds, you will get a million examples of this. And basically, the rule of thirds states, if you're unfamiliar with it, that an image, its composition is more interesting if the dominant parts of the image align with the thirds lines, either the vertical ones or the horizontal ones, and especially at the intersection of thirds lines. So you'll see, in all these first examples, we have this couple, their faces are on that intersection of that line, this wolf is there, the dog's head is here. Other common things with rule of thirds is that the axis of an object or a person is usually along one of the vertical thirds lines. So this would be an example of that. This would be an example of that. Here, this tree. I don't know if you can see that so this tree. So the axis of an object that is vertical, like a human body, is often aligned on one of the 2 vertical thirds lines. And then horizons are often on one of the horizontal lines. That's very typical. Not quite as relevant with interviews. And then let's see if I can find an example for interviews. Okay, the eyes. The eyes are often on the upper thirds lines for an interview. So let me go. This is part of the PowerPoint that I would have showed you. Let's see. So composition. Here's what I'm going through rule of thirds, headroom, look room, depth, color, and tonal contrast. So rule of thirds, horizons, axes of objects or people, and eyes. Okay, eye room or look room or nose room or lead room, I've heard all 4 of those terms used to describe this. This is the idea that you give the subject, we talked about this in class a little bit, you give the subject more room in the frame in the direction that they are looking. Whether that's a really extreme angle or whether it's almost straight on, you still want to give them look room in the direction that they are that they're oriented towards. If you don't, it really calls attention to itself as a technique, and it's usually done to make people feel like isolated or like something is wrong. And you can think of millions of TV shows and movies that break this rule intentionally. The King's Speech is one that comes to mind. And they're doing it for a specific reason. But if you're just doing a normal interview setup, basically your options are either to have them centered on the camera looking straight at you, or to have them angled one way or the other. Actually, let me pop to full screen and demonstrate this a little bit better. Okay, so one option is to have your interview subject basically centered and looking directly into the camera lens. It's a pretty unique look. You're probably not going to do that for this assignment, although I don't know. Because it's a very different semester and you might be doing different kinds of things, you might opt for this look. It tends to be more dramatic. I notice a lot of the masterclass ads that I see at the beginning of all the YouTube videos that I'm looking at, because they're all videography stuff. Whoever it is, like looking straight at the camera, Martin Scorsese, whoever it is, looking right at the camera and telling you something dramatic to make you take their class. Documentary filmmaker Errol Morris also has a technique where he does this in his films, and he actually has his face in a teleprompter, basically connected to a teleprompter, so that it's like they're looking at a teleprompter, but they're looking at an image of him, and he's in the next room conducting the interview, so they feel like they're talking to a person, but they're actually looking right into the camera. So this is a technique that you could use. Now, the far more common option for documentary filmmaking, for nonfiction filmmaking, is an interview setup where the subject. Those are my children running upstairs. A far more common way to do this is to have the subject looking slightly off screen. Now my webcam is mirrored backwards, so I've got to be careful here. All right. So if I'm going to be looking this way, then I want to be framed on this side of the screen so that I get more lead room in the direction that I'm looking. If for some reason the situation required me to be oriented this way, then I would want to change my framing to give myself lead room in that direction, right? Or more commonly the case, if you know that you need the framing to be this way, then you have to orient your subject to match that frame. So there I am using basically the rule of thirds. My eyes are on the third line, and my body is on this third line. This third line. It's hard to do with a webcam. Sorry. Okay, headroom. This is basically pulled right from Wikipedia. You'll see, basically headroom, it's kind of a Goldilocks thing. You can have too little, too much, or just right. One way to know, and as you do this more and more, it's gonna stand out to you. Oh, that's too much headroom. It's just not gonna look right. And one of the things you can look for is does the person put their subject's head right in the middle of the frame, and therefore the subject's eyes close to the middle horizontal, the 50% horizontal line in the frame? If so, that's sort of an amateur move. They need to be tilting down a little bit to get the head closer to the frame. But they don't want to get all the way to the top, at least if they're this wide of a shot, because it makes this person look kind of squunched, kind of crammed into the frame. We don't need to see this much of their chest. Come down a little bit, put those eyes on the third line right here, give us a little bit of space to breathe in the composition, and this is sort of the sweet spot right here. I'm going to go like this so you can see. I don't know if you can see this. This is probably not ideal, but I know that my little myself here, I'm covering this up. So this is indicating, these red lines are indicating that that if you were to zoom in, then you would need to tilt up a bit to maintain the right composition. So you'll see that as you get to a tight shot, a close-up, it's okay to cut off the top of the head. It's never okay to cut off somebody's chin unless it's just a weird shot. But for an interview setup, you could get really tight, cut off the top of their head. The rule of keeping their eyes on that third line is what then applies. So that's headroom. Okay, so I'm going to refer to two different videos about that where these guys walk through their process for looking at a particular space to decide on the frame. And I'm going to, and this guy you've seen before in another video, and I'm going to talk sort of about depth and tonal color contrast sort of at the same time. So first of all, depth. Depth has two components. One is the distance between the subject and the background. This is so important. Please get your interview subjects away from the background, okay? It's helpful both because it's more visually interesting to see something behind them, and also because it gives you shallow depth of field. And the second thing is vanishing lines or leading lines. So foreground objects or background objects where you can see things moving away from the subject. That really gives a sense of perspective, a sense of depth to the frame. And this guy does a really nice job of saying both of these things.
So first thing I'm looking for is to create some depth. Anytime you can create depth to your image, it's gonna look more cinematic, it's gonna look a little more professional. And so I tell people, never put yourself right up against a wall. There's absolutely no depth here.
Amen.
It's just
Please
flat. And
do
so
this.
what I'm gonna do
It's awful.
is come up against this wall here so that we can see the leading line, see the wall, see some of this depth of the room here. And I'm gonna try and position Dallin as far away from the back wall as possible. Now we could move his entire setup farther this way to create more depth between him and the back wall. The more separation you can get from your subject from the back wall, the more shallow depth of field you're gonna get. So
Okay, this is really important. I mean, look at this. This is not good. If you can, especially if you have something in the background that can be red or something that's distracting. I know you may be shooting with a phone, and that's really hard to get shallow depth of field. But if you'll pull your subject away from the background, then your focus distance is going to be small compared to the subject to background distance, and it's going to throw your background at least a little bit out of focus, and it'll give you a much better. So if you're in a space, if you have this much space to work with, a lot of times, let's just pretend that the room was this big, what's in this green square here. A lot of times people are going to put the subject maybe there and the camera maybe here. No. Get both of you as far away from the background as possible. And if he were even sitting closer to the camera and had a wider angle lens here, it would be even shallower at the field. So this is so important. Get the subject far away from the background.
Where possible, I try and get my subject as far away as possible. Now his desk is already set up here and it looks nice. I don't want to ruin that too much, so we're not going to do that, not absolutely necessary.
I want to mention one thing here in case you watch this whole video. This is a really, really good video. It's 25 minutes long. It's kind of long, but he gives you a ton of little tips along the way. One of the things he mentions here is that he wouldn't use this window as a key light because, as we talked about in class earlier, the shadows could change, like the clouds could move or something like that, or maybe the sun is going to move if this window is facing towards the sun. But he has the luxury of having a big key light that can compete with the window. So he decides to use this as a backlight. That makes a lot of sense if you have the gear. But if you don't have the gear, you might be in a situation where you have to use the window as a key light. So just keep that in mind. Okay, second video, similar. This guy's looking around this house and trying to figure out where he's going to do his interview. And I like this one because whereas the other guy in the office kind of arrived at his conclusion right away, he's going to have to think about it a little bit.
So I'm in this space and I'm going to start looking around, trying to find an angle that I enjoy. Sometimes when I'm trying to find an angle, I kind of look funny to people because I get on my hands and knees and I look at things from different angles.
Okay, this is important. This is something that you should do. And one of the things that I find students have the biggest trouble with, especially when they're doing location interviews, and just imagine you could go somewhere other than your house, is thinking about a location from the perspective of a human being rather than the camera and the frame. And they're thinking like, like the classic, like, oh, let's get a family picture in front of the Christmas tree or the sunset. And they're not thinking about the fact that you can't get the whole Christmas tree. It's a different aspect ratio than or whatever, or the sunset's really bright and that you're going to be backlit. You're not thinking about it from the point of view of the camera, of the frame. So, I mean, not that I'm telling you to go around and do this, but it's really important to be thinking about the frame. He also talks about a lot of things that we've already talked about in the videos. It's always good to get these redundant concepts. So he's talking about dynamic range here and how he's got good exposure in the background, but he needs to throw more light on the subject.
Key light. Take the back.
He's talking about what he wants to do once he finds the frame, what he wants to do with the light. He demonstrates a bounce here, which is super important. It could be helpful for you.
Without it, I felt like the shadows were a little dark.
This is really subtle, but look at what a difference it makes when he takes this away.
This is our fill light, but it's not a light. It's just
check out the left side of her face here.
Bouncing back, obviously. Without it, I felt like the shadows were a little dark.
I wish you could show us that through the camera because it's actually a pretty big difference. Okay, he talks about which side of the camera he should be sitting on. And he talks about eye lines, all the things that we were just talking about. He talks about the rule of thirds. Okay, so this is a really good video. I think you should watch it. But it's also, obviously, using a lot of technology that, once again, you don't have. So what I want to do is I want to go through an example of a time when I had to do an interview setup on the fly without any lights at all. I guess you could say it was an observational interview, but really what it was I was filming with this guy at his house in DC, and I'd never been there before. And I was shooting some B-roll with him in his house with his kids, and he's working on his computer. And then I said, hey, is there somewhere we can go quietly to have an interview? And it wasn't observational in the sense that I wanted to actually talk with him for 20 or 30 minutes. But I also had no equipment. I was all by myself. I only had my camera and my audio gear. And so he said, sure, let's go out on the back patio. So we walked out on the back patio. I was literally following him. So he was getting to the location before I was. Obviously, normally I like to have an hour to set up. And so it was very much on the fly that I had to take into consideration a lot of the things that we're talking about in this couple series of videos and then make the best choice for the situation. And I want to emphasize this. The best choice for the situation doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to look awesome. It means that you did the best with what you had, okay? So this is where I landed given about 2 minutes to start, filming and set up and talk to him all the time. You know, me being director, producer, DP, everything at once, and no lights. So let's assess. This is not awesome, but let's talk about why I landed on this to start with. First of all, can you tell where the light is coming from? Look at his face. Which side is it coming from? It's coming from this side, okay? And what do you imagine the day was like that day? I hope you can tell that this is a pretty soft light. I was actually quite lucky. Notice that there's not really any shadow of his nose on the other side of his face. This was a very overcast day, so that was very nice for me because the light was nice and diffused. And if it hadn't been, he would have had a specular highlight here on his forehead. But you can tell based on this bright spot here, the brightness under the cheek here, and the fact that what shadows there are lean towards the left side, all that gives you an indication that the light was coming from up there. So the first thing that I did when I got out there was to turn him this way so that I could use the sun as a key light. Now, normally I would have my interview subjects facing the key light. So this would be, this is a broadside key, meaning that the key is coming on the side of his face that we can see more of. I typically usually use the short side key, and that's more common. But in this case, based on what was in the background, I liked the what I was looking at here better than what I was looking at over here, which of course you can't see. So this is what I started with, and because I was going to have him, because I liked this background better, I knew that I needed to give him look room in this direction. Okay, so all these things are sort of going through your brain at the same time, almost subconsciously, and you're trying to sort of get an initial setup. Now, what's not good about this? First of all, I think he's too close to the center of the frame, and I would like him to be a little bit further over here. Secondly, compositionally, there's some really annoying things at the edges, like this row of bricks right here I find to be really distracting. And also this table is not awesome, and especially to me, this chair is a problem. And so as I'm talking to him and I'm interviewing him, listening to him, I'm also looking at the frame and I'm trying to assess, okay, what should I do? So after the first question, I reframed a bit and my next shot looked like this. Okay, so I was trying to get tighter, trying to get him a little bit more to the right side of the frame. Now, some people, I'm going to show you sort of a progression of 4 different images that I went through in real time to try to get the best setup that I could. Some people like this one best. If you like simplicity, this is going to be sort of the simplest of the setups, I suppose. And it's less distracting. I think it's better composed. What bothers me about this, and this is finally getting to my 5th point about composition, is the lack of color and tonal contrast. We do have some tonal contrast in that this wall has a natural gradient as it goes into the shadows, which is nice, and natural gradients are good. It does have depth in the sense that it's moving away from us, so we have those lines that are not either horizontal, and reinforcing the frame lines, but they're moving away from us and giving us perspective. But the fence is brown, it's a similar tone to his skin, and it basically feels like we have sort of brown, black, and purple, and those are like the only colors, only tones. It just, to me, it feels a little boring. So then I decided that I wanted to include some other stuff in the frame. So I actually asked him to move over a little bit because, of course, this whole time I could see this brick wall, which I liked, and you didn't know was there. And I thought, okay, let me see if I can get him more to be in this gap here. Although it's still not perfect. This thing looks like it's, a straw coming out of his neck, which bothers me a bit. But I thought this was a little bit more interesting, and I personally like having a pop of color here with the green. So I've reintroduced this purple. I've used this brick and the sort of 2/3 brown background and 1/3 brick background, and I like the fact that I've got 2 different planes here. So I've got this plane that's flat and this one going away, and I got some pops of color. So okay, good. But I've reintroduced some things that I don't like, especially his knee here seems awkward to me, and maybe the corner of the table as well. And so this is where I landed sort of at the end. I think he has his head sort of cocked to the side, or else he would be more along the 3rd line there. But so this is what I liked best of these 4, right? So let's just go back. This is where I started. It's fine. but less color and tonal contrast, weird things hanging out at the edge of the frame. Maybe not ideal. Here's a closer one. Maybe depending on the emotional content of the interview, this would have been a good setup, but to me it felt a little bit boring. And also to me, it didn't capture his environment at all. Like this wooden fence could have been anywhere. So I wanted something a little bit more visually interesting. I tried this, and then I made one final adjustment, and this is where I ended up. So, I mean, there's some personal preference. Maybe some of you don't like this one as well as one of the others. But this was a situation in which I was kind of where you are, where I was trying to do the best with what I've got. And I'm thinking about directionality and quality of light. I didn't have to worry about color because it was all, it was all daylight. Didn't have to worry about intensity other than setting my exposure. I'm thinking about headroom and rule of thirds. I'm thinking about look room. I'm thinking about depth, leading lines, distance between background and subject, and I'm thinking about color and tonal contrast. So for me, that's sort of my formula for doing interview setups, even when you don't have fancy equipment. Okay, lastly, webcam interviews. Several of you asked me for some tips on this, and it just so happened that I got this coming across my coming into my inbox last week from this thing called Desktop Documentaries, which I subscribe to. 10 tips for recording webcam interviews for your documentary. I will send this to you so you can look at it yourself, but this is really nice. Try to create flattering lighting. Okay, that's pretty complicated, but we've been talking about it a lot now. An external microphone, if you have it, which hopefully you do. Adjust camera to eye level. Quiet location. Use a different webcam if you can. Bypass the computer audio. Conduct test recording. Check the internet speed. Lock down your webcam settings. Choose the right webcam app. So I'm going to let you look through this, but for us to discuss really quickly, or not discuss, I guess for me to demonstrate, I did a screenshot today of our department meeting, all of the faculty from the comm department, just so you could get some examples of different webcam setups. So the things that people will naturally do when they're just told to hop on a conference call. So this is, I think, kind of instructive, and I'd like you to look at these sort of through the lens of the things that we've been talking about. So a couple of examples. Romanowski and Plantinga down here at the bottom, you can see that they're having some problems with dynamic range because the light coming through the window is just too bright compared to the other side. So if they had some diffusion, like that shower curtain that was mentioned in the one video would be really helpful here, or some sort of translucent white curtain, or potentially a bounce, like a big piece of foam board or something like that. I even used a pizza box one time for a bounce in a situation like this to fill in some of the shadows on the other side of the face. Now, that said, they do have, you can see that like here, at least Romanowski has one color temperature throughout, whereas Plantinga has this very obviously different, what we would call a practical, a light that's in the scene in the background. Now, that doesn't bother me so much. I mean, the composition's not great, but at least it's not a light source on his face, which is giving mixed color temperatures. Let's see. We've got some overexposure here. You can see several people are looking up. 1, 2, so let's see. Garrett, Jake, Kathy, Garth, they're all looking up. The computer's looking up at them, which is really awkward, so make sure to get it on eye level. Professor Whelan here is using the green screen to simulate the office background, which was clever. My setup is not good. I mean, you've been looking at it now for a long time, and this is where my office is. Sorry, but the light is behind me. I actually do have amber gels on that light to try to make it the same color temperature. But I mean, for one thing, the main light on my face is the computer screen. So like if I go to a different program here, like if I go to Premiere, I mean, look how much the light changes based on the fact that Premiere is mostly dark versus something like this. So that's one thing for me, and then I'm way backlit because my primary light in this basement office is behind me. If I turn it off, I'll turn it off. I know you're only seeing a thumbnail down here, but the background becomes very, very grainy, especially at night when I've got no daylight. So I basically have to leave that on. I will say that if I were to point my desk lamp at myself directly, this is what it would look like. And this may be your instinct, like point lights at people, right? But this is going to be harsh and not look very good. So I have this bounced into the wall and into the ceiling to give it a softer look. Geert's got very even lighting going on. I don't know what his situation is. He probably has a window right in front of him, would be my guess. Deborah here, same kind of look as down here. You got highlights. The camera just can't handle the dynamic range. So basically, what I would say is that your best bet is to try to do something like what these folks are doing with a single source, natural key light coming from a window, but to diffuse it somehow. If it's the kind of day where it's sunny, but there are clouds passing through the sky, it's kind of risky because the light can change dramatically, whether a cloud is in front of the sun or not. But it's the kind of day where you can't see any blue, it's all clouds, you might be in luck, and you can just use a window potentially, or use it with blinds, or some sort of diffusion. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I think that's all I've got for you. We'll talk tomorrow. So if you have other questions about your specific situations, obviously feel free to let me know. Thanks.